So the fact that they're afraid to even admit that U.S. submarines carrying nuclear weapons visited Japanese ports, even though everybody already knew it, suggests that they certainly don't have the political agency to start, to pull Japan out of the NPT and start a nuclear weapons program.
That's the voice of Gregory Kulacki, China Project Manager at Union of Concerned Scientists. He, along with Miyako Kurosaki, Research Coordinator at the Hiroshima Organization for Global Peace, are today's guests on Press the Button, the Plowshares Fund podcast dedicated to nuclear policy and national security. And now, here are today's co-hosts, Michelle Dover and Dr. Doreen Horschig.
Welcome back to Press the Button. Before we start, last week saw a massive resurgence of Taliban control in Afghanistan as the United States nears its final military drawdown. So many friends and colleagues are worried about what comes next for the people of Afghanistan. And my hope is that as a national security and peace-building community, we do not disengage. As Human Rights Watch reminds us, organizations and activists on the ground will continue working, and they'll need the support of the international community.
Hey, Michelle, you're right. It's been truly a few devastating days for Afghans as this humanitarian crisis is growing and fighting is escalating. All this demands sober analysis of how we got here and how the region might return to firmer footing. But turning to this week's nuclear news, what do you have in store for us today?
Last week, Representative Adam Smith called on the White House to consider a number of critical issues as the Biden-Harris administration begins the nuclear posture review. So on Early Warning, we look at what his recommendations would mean for the role of nuclear weapons in the U.S. national security strategy. And then we continue our series on new approaches to U.S. security policy. Specifically, we talk about the need for ethical reviews of security and criminal justice technologies on a national level before they are deployed.
And after that, we sit down with Gregory Kulacki, the China Project Manager at the Union of Concerned Scientists, and Miyako Kurosaki, Research Coordinator at the Hiroshima Organization for Global Peace. We talk about their newest report that finds that Japan is not an obstacle to a U.S. no first use policy. They explain why it's unlikely that Japan would develop nuclear weapons in response to a U.S. policy change. So tune in to hear how the U.S. can maintain its credibility of extended deterrence without compromising advancements to its nuclear declaratory policy.
And finally, I answer a question on the oldest nuclear weapons still in use on this week's Q&A segment. Remember, if you want your question answered on the air, shoot us a DM at PressButtonPod or send us an email at pressthebutton@plowshares.org.
And if you like what you hear, remember to hit subscribe and leave us a rating. Every little bit truly helps to grow our show and our audience, and we really, really appreciate it. But with that, let's get into today's episode. The clock is ticking.
And now, early warning, early warning, early warning, early warning. A 7-minute synopsis of this week's nuclear news.
Thanks, Del. Today I'm joined by Allen Hester, Legislative Representative for Nuclear Disarmament and Pentagon Spending at the Friends Committee on National Legislation, and Ryan Mason, a corporate security professional and MSc student in the Security Studies program at Liverpool John Moores University. Thank you both for joining.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Michelle.
As you know, we have 7 minutes to cover the week's nuclear and national security news starting now. Allen, Representative Adam Smith sent a letter to the President, Secretary of Defense, and DOE Secretary last week about the nuclear posture review, where he talked about the need for a realistic, affordable nuclear arsenal. And in particular, he called out, quote, considering whether its requirement is being driven by our adversaries or if it is instead focused to provide a credible and reliable deterrent. So how would an arsenal focused on deterrence rather than dominance look different than what we have today?
Well, I think if you look at Adam Smith's letter, it really covers three important broad themes that the nuclear disarmament community has been saying for a while. First, it references that President Biden and President Putin have both agreed that nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought, asking Biden to ensure that the nuclear posture review doesn't send the wrong signal in the midst of arms race tensions. Smith also referenced the national security strategy, which talks about the importance of reducing the role of nuclear weapons in U.S. national security strategy. And Smith recommends that the administration's next budget request reflect that reduced role. And then finally, as you said, Michelle, we need to make sure that the arsenal is focused on deterrence, not dominance. And I think another way to put that is what's essential and what's wasteful overkill. So how do you take these broad goals and reflect it in the arsenal? I think a few of Smith's more specific recommendations lay that vision out pretty well. First, he says, reduce the requirements that drive the size and diversity of the U.S. arsenal. Make sure we're only spending money on essential weapon systems that are critical and not redundant. And this is very different than some interpretations of deterrence in Washington that lean more into the rhetoric that says we need to be able to completely dominate all of our adversaries all the time across every domain, and every aspect of the defense wish list is vital to deterrence. Smith seems to be calling out that interpretation as too broad. Second, seek ways to reduce the massive cost of modernizing the current arsenal. So this could look like reviewing the necessity of the land-based missiles, the size of that part of the arsenal, and reviewing the ground-based strategic deterrent cost compared to extending our current missiles. Third, reduce the circumstances under which we would use or threaten to use nuclear weapons, specifically recommending a no first use policy, which would tell the world we're only going to use our nuclear weapons if nuclear weapons are used on us. And finally, check to see if some of our conventional weapons are already fulfilling a deterrence purpose. Again, potentially eliminating the need for some specific nuclear weapon systems that may just be redundant with our conventional capabilities.
And to be clear, Representative Adam Smith is the chair of the House Armed Services Committee, so I found it particularly interesting that he was the one to send this letter. Big picture, what comes next for the nuclear posture review process, and what other major choices do you see the Biden administration facing?
Well, I think right now the president is in a listening stage. There's going to be a lot of pressure both within his administration and in Congress, all with competing viewpoints about what is vital to national security in this era of increased tensions and heightened rhetoric. So his posture and his guidance within the NPR is going to send a message to adversaries. It's going to send a message to allies about how the president is planning to tackle some of these issues. And I don't think he would be doing a nuclear posture review if he agreed with every aspect of Trump's 2018 posture review, which we know didn't shy away from the Cold War fire and fury rhetoric. So I think ultimately the big choice in front of the president is, do I reattach myself to this Cold War model of responding to every threat with mutually assured destruction? Or do I use this NPR as a tool to reinforce my return to diplomacy message? Do I avoid falling into the arms race trap? And instead, do I prioritize diplomatic means to reduce tensions and rebuild trust with the nuclear armed states?
Thanks, Allen. Ryan, switching gears, congratulations on your essay, which made recommendations for how we should be selling surveillance technology. And the essay received an honorable mention in New America's Reshaping U.S. Security Policy for the COVID-Era competition. Now, over the past month, the Pegasus Project, an international investigative journalism initiative, revealed government's espionage on journalists, opposition politicians, civil society leaders, and many others using the private Pegasus spyware developed and sold by the NSO Group, a cyber technology firm, which is basically straight out of what you're talking about. How can we create more transparency when it comes to purchasing and using security and criminal justice technology?
There's a number of things that I think we can do to help stem the tide of the proliferation of this sort of technology. Number one, really limiting who has access to this top tier technology, right? So the NSO Group was supposedly selling this to only, governmental actors at the highest level for, terrorism and, child pornography, child sexual exploitation materials to uncover that sort of level of criminality. And unfortunately, whenever this sort of technology gets widely utilized, it ends up going down to the lowest levels, as well as being used and targeted against dissidents around the world. And repressive regimes have utilized this technology in ways that I think we're still uncovering. There's a number of other things that governments can do, really putting a line in the sand for the commercial use of this technology. You shouldn't be able to make a business, frankly, out of selling spyware to anyone. This should be an inherently governmental function that if we are going to do this, for the sake of national security, governments have to really own up to the fact that, they're utilizing this technology. The U.S. plays very coy with the fact that, we are procuring zero-day exploits for, mobile devices, computers around the world from some of the very same, if not worse actors, and finally, really wrangling in the security around this technology. The NSA lost its own exploit kit several years ago with the Shadow Brokers hack. And, that has caused untold misery for, both, commerce, civil society, as well as, friendly governments.
Do you think there is a way that we can make the acquisition of these technologies compatible with the right to privacy that we have here in the United States?
So that's a very difficult question, right? Because there are a number of offsetting, equities that, governments, especially the U.S. government, will cite. The need to get around encrypted devices, the need to, combat some really high-level criminals. And on the other hand, the harm that these technologies cause is, I think, frankly, hasn't even really been fully developed. It's going to be very difficult, especially, in a democratic society such as ours, to allow, governmental use of these technologies and then say, whoa, we're going to put the brakes on all this other use, right? Because code is inherently different than, other physical type of, munitions or arms, whether they be nuclear or conventional. It's very difficult to stop the proliferation of those technologies once they're out in the world. And really, it's to all of our benefit that devices be as secure as possible, even if that security enables some level of criminality or, bad actors around the world. Because the net gain of that security, I think, will largely offset, the other negative externalities posed by criminal actors. There's still really great ways to investigate crime that do not involve utilizing technologies that can spread into, essentially any device around the world that has that particular vulnerability.
Well, 7 minutes flies by. Ryan, Allen, thank you so much for joining. Today I'm joined by Gregory Kulacki, China Project Manager at Union of Concerned Scientists, and Miyako Kurosaki, Research Coordinator at the Hiroshima Organization for Global Peace, who are both currently based in Japan. They, along with Jennifer Knox, released a report last month called Japan is Not an Obstacle to a U.S. No First Use Policy. It comes at a key moment as the Biden administration begins drafting its nuclear posture review. Gregory and Miyako, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
So the Biden administration is just starting its nuclear posture review, and we expect that the president will be deciding whether or not to adopt a no first use policy for the United States. Whenever this comes up, we hear arguments that if the United States adopted such a policy, its allies, in particular Japan, would consider building their own nuclear weapons. And your report concludes that it's highly unlikely that Japan would do so. Why is that so?
That's a great question, yeah. The Japanese government assessed the nuclear option twice. Both studies concluded political, diplomatic, and economic costs outweigh the benefits. The factors underlying this calculation has not changed. And also, over majority of Japanese population support the abolition of nuclear weapons and oppose Japan developing their own nuclear weapons. So the nuclear option would not get support from the public. And in terms of the claim that Japan would consider building their own nuclear weapons if the US adopts a no first use policy, a small group of government officials have this claim, and their explanation is not clear enough because there is no scenario for first use and no explanation why NFU policy would undermine Japan's security. So considering all these points, it is highly unlikely that Japan will develop its own nuclear weapons if the US adopts the NFU policy.
So where exactly did this sense that Japan wants to see the United States maintain a first-use policy come from?
Well, former Energy Secretary Moniz is now on the public record saying Japan lobbied against no first use. But UCS learned of Japanese opposition very early from a man named Akiba Takeo, who was then a Japanese foreign ministry official at the embassy in Washington and who is now the equivalent of the U.S. National Security Advisor in Japan. And he told us directly that the government, the foreign ministry, was opposed to no first use. We also heard it from other members of the Japanese foreign ministry and from other sources inside the Obama administration.
And you describe this history of secret discussions between Japanese and U.S. officials on the issue of no first use and nuclear weapons policy writ large. I mean, you just described how much it took to get some of these comments and descriptions much later after the fact. Why were these meetings kept secret, and how have they impacted the resulting policy?
Well, you really have to ask them why they don't want to disclose this to the public. But there's a long history, and Miyako can talk a little bit about that. But in this particular instance, there was testimony. Mr. Akiba testified to the Perry-Schlesinger Commission on America's nuclear posture. And it was held by the U.S. Institute of Peace, and it should have been a public access event, but at least the archives of it should have been able to be reviewed. And they didn't even let members of the Japanese Diet who were pursuing an investigation of Mr. Akiba's testimony see the records. So they managed to use their bureaucratic authority to sort of contain any sort of public discussion of their views. They also used that commission testimony, that event, to establish this extended deterrence dialogue between the United States and Japan that's now held twice every year. And UCS has FOIA'd documents from that. Our first request was filed in February of 2019, and we have yet to receive a single piece of paper.
Miyako, is there anything that you would add to that?
First, I'm going to explain what is the three non-nuclear policy principles. This is very important Japanese national policy, and because the Japanese public keeps a very high level of support for the elimination of nuclear weapons because of the experiences of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The Prime Minister, Eiichiro Sato, first outlined the three non-nuclear principles in 1967, and the principles were adopted at Diet in 1971. So what the principles? They prohibit the possessing and producing nuclear weapons and introducing these weapons, mainly US nuclear weapons, into Japanese territory. As I said, this is very important Japanese national policy, and the public pays attention whether the government maintains them.
You mentioned that there was an agreement between the U.S. and Japan. Can you tell me a little bit more about that?
They have an agreement that to have the prior consultation about the introduction of the nuclear weapons into Japan. This agreement is not clear, and they have an ambiguity about the language. And later, they realize that their understanding of the subject to the prior consultation is different. For the Japanese government, they understand that the introduction of nuclear weapons is subject to have that prior consultation. But the US understood that the introduction is not mean transit of naval vessels, but the placement of the nuclear weapons in the Japanese territory. So they realized that the differences, but they intentionally keep that ambiguity. They use that don't ask, don't tell bureaucratic arrangement for that understanding of the language between the US and Japan.
And given everything that you've said about how the Japanese public feels about this, I can imagine that that must be then the reason that there is so much secrecy around it.
Yeah, it was reported many times that the Japanese government did such a strategy. This report shows it's correct. Before that report is published, we think, yeah, the government might do that, but there is no evidence. The government didn't want to do the investigate about rumor. But now it was revealed that it is true. And people worry about this is kind of breaking the third principles, which is prohibiting the introducing nuclear weapons into Japan's territory. So I think this is very important report that the public have to pay attention what the government do.
There's two things I would add to that are important here. The first is that the reason they behave this way is because they know the public would oppose their behavior, which suggest, and they wouldn't be able to launch a nuclear weapons program without the public knowing about it. So the fact that they're afraid to even admit that U.S. submarines carrying nuclear weapons visited Japanese ports, even though everybody already knew it, suggests that they certainly don't have the political agency to pull Japan out of the NPT and start a nuclear weapons program. The other thing is that we're considering the development of this new submarine launched cruise missile, and that's the exact weapon that used to visit Japanese ports on U.S. attack submarines. So those are two very important things to keep in mind.
Going back to this sense of how the public opinion around this has forced the Japanese government, who holds parts of the government which hold a contrary opinion, to, keep it secret. How strong do you see this public opinion today around nuclear weapons, and how do you see it affecting the modern Japanese policies in this area?
I think the Japanese public still highly support the elimination of nuclear weapons, and 75% of the Japanese public support the nuclear ban treaty which is entered into force in January this year, the Japanese public tried to push the government to sign on the treaty. And also, they keep watching whether the government maintains the three non-nuclear principles. And there is an interesting story that in 2015, Prime Minister Abe did not mention the principles in his speech at Hiroshima Peace Memorial Ceremony. And people were doubting why he didn't mention it. Because the principles has been mentioned in Prime Minister's speech at the ceremonies in Hiroshima and Nagasaki every year since 1994. So people scrutinize that the Prime Minister's speech at the ceremony in Hiroshima and Nagasaki is the place they kind of check whether they maintains or not. So the government also needs to take a policy around the nuclear weapons, maintain these principles, I think.
Yeah, and after Abe got caught, he was later forced to apologize for omitting the mention of it. And I think, Miyako, you said the same thing happened with Prime Minister Suga this year, right?
Yeah, this is, but the situation is a little bit different because he skipped some sentences of his speech. So it's his mistake, purely, I think. And he apologized in the media conference, I think. But the Prime Minister Abe's speech is he read the draft, and draft doesn't have the words. So we are wondering why you excluded.
So turning from this, this focus on what's going on within Japan and this divide between the government and the people, and turning back to look at the United States with this NPR, what are your recommendations for President Biden in moving forward?
Well, I mean, simply that he really doesn't need to consider Japan as a factor in his decision. If he wants to declare no first use, Japan should not be a consideration. There is no need to worry that Japan is going to quit the NBT and develop its own nuclear weapons if the United States makes this change in nuclear weapons policy.
I want to thank you both for bridging that divide and taking some of these studies, this historical context, and pulling it together and making it accessible to those around the world. Where can people find your report?
They can visit our website at ucsusa.org or our blog, allthingsnuclear.org.
Miyako, Gregory, thank you so much for joining.
It was a pleasure, Michelle.
Thank you for having us. Thank you.
And now for everyone's favorite nuclear Q&A. Are you ready, Michelle?
Go ahead, Doreen.
This week's question comes from Kelsey from Albuquerque. Kelsey asks, do we know what the oldest nuclear weapon still in an arsenal is?
Hey, Kelsey. So the answer is we probably do. The U.S.'s oldest weapons are likely the B-61 3s and 4s, or it could be the Minuteman III's W-78. Both of those are from 1979, although when you think about the B-61 series, that's the oldest. And so the B-61 3s and 4s are tactical nuclear weapons, meaning they have a shorter range, a typically smaller yield or explosion. In this case, they are what we call gravity bombs, bombs that are dropped from aircraft, in this case, the F-15 or F-16. And about 150 of these are thought to be deployed at 6 bases in 5 European countries: Italy, Germany, Turkey, Belgium, and the Netherlands. However, Russia may be fielding an older system. There is a single fixed air defense site, a REDUT system in Crimea, and that is thought to be nuclear capable, and if so, is from 1973. And so, in that case, Russia is the one who is likely fielding the oldest nuclear weapons system. And, I want to say, though, how do we know this, right? Like, this is not something that is necessarily easy to find out or that governments like to post on their websites. Thanks to this, it really goes to Matt Korda and Hans Christensen at the Federation of American Scientists and all of the work that they've done, and it has been published in the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists Nuclear Notebook. And really what they have done is over the years pulled together the existing publicly available information, the research that's been done, and keeping track of what we know about when systems are upgraded or replaced or pulled out of the arsenal. And so that's why we can say that that is likely the case.
Another week, another question. Thanks, Michelle, and thanks, Kelsey, for this interesting question. And remember, if you want your question answered on the air, shoot us a DM at PressButtonPod or send us an email at pressthebutton@plowshares.org.
Thanks for listening to Press the Button. This podcast is produced and edited by Alex Hall in Washington, D.C., and Delphine Vigil in San Francisco, with research and assistance from Doreen Horschig and Harry Tarpey. Sound design and audio engineering by Michael Padilla at the Soundport Recording Studio in Grass Valley, California. Our theme song is by Lyrics Born and the Poets of Rhythm, sampled with kind permission. Additional music by San Francisco-based bands 17 Evergreen and the Society of Rockets. To continue the dialogue and support our work, visit plowshares.org.